Hello. Good morning. This is Matthias Kurz, and I'm sharing my monthly COVID-19 update. And to that purpose, as always, I will share my screen. There we are. Today's headline is 18 months in. 18 months ago, at the beginning of March 2020, this whole COVID affair really got started. It started a bit earlier in China, certainly, and in a few other places in late February, but broadly speaking, for most of the world, it started in early March. So we are now 18 months into that. And so this is our 1st of September update for the year one after Homo sapiens. I skipped one. I wanted to start with a little quote. Since we are globally, humanity has become masochistic, we may as well start with Leopold von Sacher-Masoch. Whoever allows himself to be whipped deserves to be whipped. I think that's pretty much all of us right now. Next, I wanted to just go back to what I said last time about how we should be thinking about COVID-19. And I was arguing that SARS-CoV-2 is a common cold coronavirus, and that occasionally a common cold virus, any common cold virus, can trigger a pneumonia, and that COVID-19 is just a pneumonia that happens to be triggered by this particular virus. Pneumonias can be triggered by viruses, by bacteria, which is actually the most common trigger, but viruses are also common, and it can be any of the 200 plus common cold viruses that can trigger a pneumonia under certain circumstances, and the same is true for influenza viruses and other viruses. So pneumonia is a very common so-called infectious disease. I will talk about that in a moment. And in that context, I was saying we need to understand SARS-CoV-2. And I've been saying this for well over a year, actually 15 months or so, so this is not really new, but I sort of went back to that topic because it is just amazing that the world doesn't talk about it this way. And I was just arguing, this is how we should be talking about it and thinking about it. So basically, we are dealing with a common cold that in some rare cases turns into or triggers a pneumonia. And a pneumonia is a dangerous lung disease that can be fatal. So we talked about all of that. I don't want to repeat all of what I said previously. I just wanted to point out that, and I had sort of passed through that quickly last time and hadn't myself reflected on it. So what we saw here, this is just wikimedia.com, just wikipedia.com, yeah, just, general knowledge out there. So you can find that online easily. And of course, there's a lot more about pneumonia and about common cold online. It's just that nobody seems to be looking there in the context of COVID-19 because they're looking into the wrong place. So they're not looking at all. But, it's all out there. And one of the things that I sort of highlighted in red at the bottom, but didn't really reflect on myself very much is that, children, so the average adult gets 2 or 3 colds per year, meaning you get colonized by common cold viruses. You may be colonized by them all the time, but most of the time your immune system suppresses them so effectively that you don't have any symptoms. But 2 or 3 times a year you have symptoms that in layman's terms we call a common cold. And you all know the symptoms, right? Because you've all had it 2 or 3 times a year throughout your life. And now when you were children, and I don't know what the definition is of child, and I haven't found a definition of child, but they may get as many as 6 to 8 per year. And, I thought last time, well, that, it makes sense, right? Because a child's immune system, A, is not yet fully developed. B, the faster it develops, the better. So to permit a child to have 6 to 8 common colds per year without normally having any problem with that, just means nature has it such that when we are young, we sort of get an accelerated path towards full immunity against any of the 200 plus common cold viruses, right? So the more common colds you get in your childhood, the quicker you get there, basically. And nature has it such because it apparently makes sense, right? And that's partially because children barely ever have a real problem with common colds. That may be a bit different for influenza, where you have very high rates of severe illness among the very small children, but with common cold, that doesn't seem to be the case. So nature has it such that, as children, we get exposed all the time, of course, and we develop symptoms more frequently than adults, which just means that we have more interactions with one of those 200 plus viruses that we had not previously interacted with. By the time you're an adult, you've seen them all. Your immune system has encountered all of them, and they're no longer new, and so it's harder for them to even colonize you, and it's less likely that you will have symptoms. So that all made sense to me, and I didn't think about that any further. But let me just bring up my screen. So children get the common cold more often, which makes sense, as I said. It just accelerates the adaptation of the adaptation, of their immune system to the full cocktail of 200 plus common cold viruses. However, then I thought, okay, but what does it tell us specifically for SARS-CoV-2? Does it tell us anything? And when I thought back as a parent, so since they're not defining what they mean by child, does it mean from zero, from birth to 10 to 12 to 14 to 18, right? I was trying to think back, and this is very subjective, of course, and may not be quite accurate. Maybe I should have asked my wife; she would perhaps know better. But I feel like the little ones had common colds, especially when they were sort of in kindergarten and elementary school. They probably had colds right after birth, but when you're newborn, you're not so exposed. You're exposed to the mother and to some degree the rest of the family, etc. But my recollection was that most of these colds that we experienced were between like age 2, when the children started getting into pre-kindergarten, through maybe year, I don't know, 8, maybe 10. And then it sort of starts going down. So by the time they're in puberty, they no longer have more colds. It's my subjective feeling. They no longer have more colds than adults do, right? So I've taken, again, this is very rough and ready, and some expert would be able to enlighten me on this, but I just haven't talked to any expert. But my feeling is that this phase in which children have a significantly accelerated rate of getting cold symptoms, double or more than what an adult would experience, takes about 6 to 8 years. Now that's interesting, because what that means is it takes us 6 to 8 years to get to the point where we've encountered every one of those cold viruses. Yeah. Which means we're not encountering them maybe as frequently as I would have thought. Yeah, if it may take up to 6 to 8 years for that first encounter, and that's maybe not an average number, that's maybe the extreme number, right? On average, maybe it's then 3 to 4 years or so. But it takes longer for the child to get to the point where it's been fully exposed than maybe I would have thought. Just thinking about it, right? Now, by implication, most of us are not children, we're adults, but we are now going through the same process with SARS-CoV-2 that a child normally goes through with all the different cold viruses, right? Meaning we're starting to get exposed to it and adapt to it. And when I say 200 cold viruses, you then have to multiply that by all the different variants, right? I mean, we are now into the Delta variant, this SARS-CoV-2, but they're now talking about the next thing just popping up, and a version like a Delta version 2.0, or so sub version of that, and eventually there will be new strains, as we talked about, but that may not happen that often, but we'll see. We don't know that really yet. But certainly there will continue to be mutations and variants. And I talked about last time how our sort of vaccination mania, as I call it, trying to roll out vaccines to all and sundry around the world, most of whom do not need them and do not benefit from them. One thing it does, it puts this new SARS-CoV-2 virus at a competitive disadvantage compared to all the 200 other, cold viruses, the peer group, if you like, right? So they're competing for them with them for like real estate, which is this real estate here, right? And their market share at the very beginning may have been quite high because they were new to us and we couldn't deal with them as well as with the others, and therefore we allowed them more market share. But with the vaccines now, we're putting them under a lot of pressure because the vaccine hits only the SARS-CoV-2 and not the other 200 cold viruses, right? So it puts SARS-CoV-2 at a disadvantage. And what I said last time is that could mean that we're putting evolutionary pressure artificially onto this new virus to mutate faster. Logically speaking, under evolutionary pressure, under environmental pressure, where there's a lot of competition for limited resources, that, let's say, limited real estate of this sort that they like, there could be a tendency of them to mutate faster into new strains, which may give them relative competitive advantage. Yeah, so they will try to regain the competitive advantage under the pressure of the vaccine by mutating faster, especially by mutating new variants that are less affected by the vaccine. Right? So our whole vaccine mania may lead to an accelerated mutation of this virus. Right? I've previously spoken about our segmentation of our global market, if you like, into little islands, by having strict border controls may lead to a diversification of those mutants that can survive, right? Because in the local ecosystem, a mutant can survive that might not survive in the bigger ecosystem, where it's maybe not the strongest, right? But in its local, let's say New Zealand, if you're like hermetically closed off, over time you might have a New Zealand variant that does not exist anywhere else, right? Which might have implications for the efficacy of vaccines, etc. But we talked about all of that. But I think more importantly here is this evolutionary pressure we are putting on the virus, on this particular virus, SARS-CoV-2, via our global rollout, massive rollout of vaccines, yeah, which are not hitting the other cold viruses. This is different from the physical, the sort of mechanical policies that we had in terms of lockdowns, for example. If you lock people down and they interact less, that affects all our viruses equally. So it doesn't change the relative competitive position of one virus against the other, at least not in a significant way, I don't think. With the vaccine is different because it's targeted precisely against SARS-CoV-2 only, and it does not affect the other 200 common cold viruses that we're dealing with. And so it puts this particular one at a disadvantage, which is sort of what the vaccine is supposed to do, I understand. Yeah, I know that's what the vaccine is supposed to do, put this one at a disadvantage. But what I'm saying is one of the unintended side effects of that, or consequences of that, could be that it mutates faster to evade the vaccine, or to evade that relative competitive disadvantage that we are putting it under compared to its peer group. Okay, anyway, so I had previously said, it might take 2 to 3 years, and why did I say 2 to 3 years? Well, early on, I was just observing at what speed does this thing move, right? I mean, there were early studies on secondary attack rates, and, I talked about that well over a year ago. And maybe not on video, but in letters to Frau Merkel or whatever. So, I mean, it was quite clear that this virus wasn't quite as fast as influenza, but it was reasonably fast. And you do assume always that new mutants will be quicker, by definition. Remember, I said that before. By definition, they will be quicker. If they are not quicker, they will not be visible to us because they have no competitive advantage over the established ones. So the incumbents will just stay the incumbents. So a new competitor, a new mutant, can only be successful if it's quicker. By definition, almost, therefore, any new variant will be quicker than the previous ones, or at least as quick. Yeah, as quick, if not quicker. Otherwise, it can't establish itself, right? So we knew that the transmission rate will tend to increase over time. Didn't know by how much, right? But we could see this virus is fairly quick, but it's not as quick as influenza, right? And so I looked at influenza waves, and somehow this was very gut feel. Okay, 2 to 3 years was my early expectation about how long it would take for most of us to be exposed to this virus, right? To have been exposed to this virus and having built therefore an immunity to this virus. So I always thought in 2 to 3 year kind of dimensions, and my very first estimate for fatalities was 15 million over 3 years. That was my very first model in June last year. And that was based on that assumption. It takes 2 to 3 years, and then an assumption for an IFR, etc. Okay, I guess what I'm saying here, what this data about children tells me that I might have been too optimistic. It takes longer for the entire population of the world to get exposed to this virus a first time. And also because it mutates and there are new variants, and they will be increasingly diverse and different in important respects from the previous ones, there is an ongoing learning experience or exposure experience for our immune system, not just to one variant, but to the whole slew of variants, right? So we can think of this SARS-CoV-2 not just as one virus, but a family of viruses, if you like, or a cloud. And over time, we need to get, our immune system needs to get exposed to all of them, ideally, in order, and the faster the better, because we are getting older and not younger, right? And the younger you are, the better. So the better in the sense that the lower your risk that anything goes wrong, right? And so the quicker we can expose ourselves to that cloud, the better, right? And then once we've had 2, 3, 4, 5 different variants that we are already, cognizant of, our immune system has encountered and has a memory of, I think, and this is conceptual, this is not empirical, but conceptually you can imagine that every new variant then becomes less and less of an issue. I mean, the issue is, thankfully 99% of us have no issue to start with, right? Remember, only 1% of us have a real issue with this virus, right? But what I'm saying is over time, we want to get that to 0, right? 1% is still 79 million people, right? Some of whom have already died now, right? And others are yet to die, right? So we want to get that to 0, and nature wants us to get that to 0. And to get to sort of 0, or something that is, not 0, but not very far away from 0. So there will always be some fatalities from this pneumonia, just like the other cold viruses can induce a pneumonia. That pneumonia can then turn out to be fatal. That's always possible, right? So it's never 0 actually, but you're approaching sort of something that is not very far away from 0, right? That's where you want to get, right? And I think I had thought, oh, after 2 or 3 years, we'll be basically there. And I'm now saying, worst case, right? So if the average child takes 6 to 8 years, and adults may be slower, by the way, in adapting to this kind of thing, right? So because now we are, as adults, we are forced by nature to go through a process that normally we would have gone through as a little child. When we're probably best, in the best position to do it, right? And that's just because this virus is new and wasn't around when we were children, right? So I guess what I'm saying is, if the children take 6 to 8 years, if that number is roughly correct, to get through the whole soup, the whole cloud of common cold viruses, the whole I called it cocktail before, the whole set. If they take 6 to 8 years to get through the whole thing, it could take up to 6 to 8 years for the whole global population to get through this one new SARS-CoV-2. And since most of us are adults, it may even take longer than 6 to 8 years. So that is the thought process I went through, thinking about what I had shared last time. But last time I hadn't had that thought. So I just wanted to use this first part of the session to just sort of follow up on what I said last time and just say, it seems to me we cannot assume that 2 to 3 years will be sufficient for almost the entire global population to have immunized against this virus, including its variants. Yeah, that was maybe too optimistic from this data point. Given that we're dealing with a common cold virus, I would think let's assume 6 to 8 years. Right? And it will not be 100%, right? I mean, I never said it will be. I mean, there will always be some humans who have never encountered a certain virus. You know, you could say, either call them lucky or unlucky. That depends on which angle you're taking there, but they just haven't, right? I mean, that will always be a possibility, right? There will be some remote places where the cocktail is more limited and not all 200 viruses are present, right? Yeah, so that, I mean, we'll never get like 100% of the human population, but, you know, I was always thinking, one of my, the last few pages that I usually share, which I share again today, I talk of 99%. Right? So 99%, I know there's always going to be a few people who just don't get exposed, right? But, you know, let's say 99% will get exposed. And what I'm now saying is 99%, doesn't just mean once to the original variety or variant, but it means multiple times to multiple variants, right? And I'm saying, and that will not take 2 to 3 years, but more likely, it seems to me, we should think in terms of 6 to 8 years. Yeah, that may have implications on policy. Remember, because policy is driven by one, of course, stupidly, the cases of detected infections, right? That we've always known as silly, because we've always known since 18 months ago that we will get repeatedly infected, right? Because we know that for common cold viruses, our immune system doesn't keep antibodies in the blood for very long, maybe for 6 or 9 months or so, but, you know, it just isn't worthwhile keeping them. A, because these variants then keep changing anyways. B, it just isn't dangerous enough for the immune system to go through all that effort, because it all takes energy, right? And our human body is extremely energy efficient in what it does, right? And otherwise we wouldn't be surviving, right? So it has to be. And you know, our system has just decided probably long ago that it is not worthwhile keeping these antibodies in the blood for a virus that is essentially harmless, right? With very few exceptions, right? So it's a probabilistic game that our body plays, and, you know, it puts its assets and its, you know, competence and its money where its mouth is, so to speak, where the biggest bang for the buck can be achieved. And common colds are not where you can have a big bang for your buck if you overinvest in, you know, keeping all these antibodies up and running all the time. It's just a sunk cost or an overinvestment that doesn't get a good return, right? So the body will look for other things to do with its limited resources, and that's thankfully it is like that, right? Even if at this very moment we may be bothered by that, because you might say, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had something already ready for this new SARS-CoV-2 that is sort of similar? No, but that's not how it works, right? So yeah, so there's always this, with a new virus, there's an adjustment period that humanity has to go through, and that we are now sort of 18 months into, right? Or maybe more than 18 months. And what I'm saying is that may take 6 to 8 years rather than just 2 to 3 years, that adjustment period. The policy implications, so first of all, as long as the policymakers measure infections, it will lead us nowhere, because those infections will just recur, right? Because our immune system doesn't keep those antibodies, and therefore sooner or later you'll get infected again, inevitably, right? So counting infections is useless, right? We've always said that, right? However, this also means if governments shift, eventually maybe someone in government will start waking up about that, right? If they shift to saying, no, we measure hospitalizations, yeah, which is more sensible from an operating point of view, because that's really where you want to invest your money. You want to make sure you have enough capacity. You want to project how many cases will you have in hospital, not cases in terms of testing positive on a PCR test, but people in hospital with pneumonia. You want to predict that so that you can have the capacity ready, right? Which we could have done over the last 18 months, but most governments, I think, haven't, right? Which is as I said before, it's a sort of murder, right? To know that this is a pneumonia and you can prepare for it in a certain way. You cannot fully avoid it, and, you know, some people will die, but you can make it that you can reduce the likelihood that someone who's hospitalized will get killed by it, by having the right equipment, the right training, and so on and so forth. And by and large, governments haven't done that. Now, the medical profession, the people who actually work on the ground in the hospitals, I'm sure they're doing a lot of good things, so don't get me wrong. I'm sure that, because basically this is just a pneumonia, and this is something that the medical systems need to deal with. Actually, the best would have been if government would not have gotten involved at all in this whole COVID thing. If they had just left it to the professionals, it would have been the best thing, right? But as governments are, alarm, yeah, exception, state of exception, yeah, throw the constitution out of the window, yeah. We must act, because not acting is not an option for politicians, right? But actually, we would have been better off with all those politicians that just shut up. We would have been better off, but yeah, they don't, right? They don't know how to do it. So they will have new policies, and those new policies will be linked maybe more to hospitalizations. And so what I'm saying here is, which is certainly better than linking them to just PCR test results, which makes no sense at all. So linking policy to hospitalizations, for example, makes more sense. But what we will see is that the hospitalizations will maybe stay above the long-term average. And by the way, I'll show that in a moment. It's been trending down, actually. Pneumonia has been trending down globally. Pneumonia derived from any trigger, any virus or any bacteria, has been trending down, right? Which, yeah, we may all agree is a good thing, isn't it? Yeah, but so what's happened in the last 18 months? It's bumped up quite significantly, more than doubled, thanks to this one new virus, right? But that's a temporary event, and it bumps up, and then it will gradually go back to normal. And my point here is, it may not take only 2 or 3 years to get back to the normal level of pneumonia, but it may take 6 to 8 years, just because that tail end, the tapering off, does seem to take longer than I thought, because it does seem to take longer for all of us to get that exposure. And that's what I'm taking from this data around children, right? That it takes 6, and that's my parent subjective feeling, is it takes 6 to 8 years for children to get through that stage where they have a heightened frequency of colds, meaning they're more likely to get a cold because they haven't yet been exposed to the full cocktail, right? So something, so the immune system has a harder time to contain it than the adults, where they've been exposed to everything. Yeah, so that process, if it takes 6 to 8 years at least, and for adults maybe it might take even longer, then we are looking probably for 8 to 10 years or something, until our pneumonia numbers have fallen back down to the level, to the trend line that they were on before. This is not dramatic. This is not, actually, as I say, the trend for pneumonia has been down, and the thing is, nobody notices. Yeah? I didn't know that until I looked it up, right? It went from like 4 million fatalities just maybe 10 years ago, to less than 3 million. So it's like trending down at a significant rate. So this is great, yeah. Ever fewer people die of pneumonia, but nobody cares, right? But now that it's, for change, against the trend, has bumped up, everybody cares. And that's the worry. Yeah, the worry is that policymakers and people do not realize that this is just a temporary bump because one new virus came along, and it's going to taper off. And yes, it may take a bit longer than I would have hoped to taper off, but it is tapering off. It's probably already tapering off. And, and we can just safely ignore that, as we usually do. Normally nobody talks about pneumonia and how many million people die of pneumonia, or sepsis, or the other complications that are linked to pneumonia, right? Nobody talks about that except professionals in like arcane, technical magazines. They talk about this, yeah, which is good. They should, but the general population doesn't care, right? And the problem we may have for the next 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, that we don't get rid of this in our minds, because people somehow now have been triggered and psychologically become so attached to COVID that, the point is this: actually, governments should just hand this back to the medical profession, to the healthcare system, to run with it. That's what governments should actually do, and immediately. I'm not saying sometime in the future. I mean, you could just switch over to say, okay, this is just another pneumonia, hand over to the professionals, please, and maybe, of course, governments may have to invest in hospitals insofar as they have a public healthcare system, right? If it's not primarily private, but primarily public, then the public sector has to invest. I'm not arguing it shouldn't. I'm not arguing that governments cannot sponsor research into vaccinations or into medications. Of course they can, and they should, as they do with other medical things. I'm just saying this is no different, right? And if it's considered a priority, yeah, then put a bigger chunk of money into your budget for the next 2, 3, 4 years. That's cool. Just don't destroy humanity because of it. Right? Just leave it to the medical profession to deal with. Right? And if they scream and say, "Oh, our capacity is too limited," yeah, well, then you give them money, let them build capacity. Right? But it doesn't need a state of emergency and a complete sort of cutting off of all basic human rights. That's not needed. It's not even helpful in any way. Right? It just makes matters worse. Right? So that point in time where governments start realizing that this is just another medical issue like so many others, and the professionals are the best to deal with that in the healthcare system, that point may be more than 2 or 3 years away. Or on my original thinking, now we're 18 months in, right? I would have thought, oh, by let's say early next year, governments will hit the switch and say, okay, we are through this, and the rest. Yes, there are still cases. Yes, there are still fatalities, but that's business as usual for the healthcare system, right? That point where they hit that switch, instead of happening, let's say, by sometime next year, I am now worried, maybe several years away, because of this data here, because there could well be a somewhat heightened incidence of pneumonia for a few years to come. And if governments don't change their mindset and say, okay, that it's a pneumonia and so be it. So yeah, I mean, 10 years, 20, 30 years ago, we had twice as many fatalities of pneumonia. Nobody cared, right? And as a proportion of the global population, that was much more than it is now, right? Because the population was smaller, right? I mean, but nobody cared, right? But to get this out of the, I mean, the key challenge for humanity is to get this thing out of the heads of our politicians as quickly as possible. Because it is only our politicians and their policies that make us all this trouble that we're in. So we have to find a way to get this out of their heads. Maybe they need a new toy. Maybe we need to start a war somewhere. And I'm not kidding. Yeah, I'm not kidding. Now we have Afghanistan. Thank you. Taliban. Thank you very much to the Taliban. I mean, at least some of the media now is not about COVID. It's about Taliban. Another red herring, right? I mean, media need red herrings. And thank you to the Taliban to give them a new red herring that they can deal with, so that they can go catching the herring. Because then COVID is a bit further down in the in the communication hierarchy, and that's good. It needs to ideally disappear from the media. That would be the best, right? Because then policymakers, if it's no longer in the media, if they think the voters don't care, then policymakers immediately don't care either, right? Because all they care about is their power, et cetera, right? So we have to find a way to get this out of their minds. And I'm worried that it will not automatically drop away because of this 6 to 8 year or so period that the adjustment may take, that our immune systems globally take to fully adjust to this new virus. And unfortunately, that's quite a long period of time. And so I'm really worried that this will just drag on and on and on. And I'm not joking when I say we need to find something, a new red herring. Now, I'm also worried that we get the wrong red herring. Now a lot of debate about climate change, as I said before, I think that's the next big red herring, and a much bigger one than this, and even more impositions on our freedoms because of whatever people think about climate. I mean, it's the next hysteria, basically. Right? So hopefully we'll find something else. Yeah, the Taliban is good. Yeah, because it's a real practical tangible situation, right, that a politician can get their teeth into, right, which is what they want to do. They want to get their teeth into something, right, and we need to keep them occupied, like little children, right? Little children, you have to keep them occupied, then they will not make you much trouble, right? And politicians are just like that, right? So we need to find more Talibans, you know, to get our politicians to take their mind off COVID, because COVID doesn't need these politicians. They just make matters worse. So hopefully we'll find something, but basically this is not good news in the sense that if we do not find something to distract our politicians, they may terrorize us for years and years and years to come because of something that is basically trivial, right? But they just don't realize it's trivial, or they don't want to realize it's trivial, or they say, well, it doesn't matter what I realize, as long as my electorate doesn't realize that it's trivial, then I don't either, because I want to be reelected, right? So yeah, whatever it is, the fear is that this will drag on and on and on for longer than I would have originally thought. Sorry, long talk for a simple point, but that's what I wanted to add here. So to go to the next one. So I wanted to share a little bit about pneumonia, because last time I said, okay, COVID-19 is basically pneumonia, a pneumonia triggered by SARS-CoV-2. There are many, many other pneumonias triggered by various, you can read here, viruses or bacteria or other microorganisms, right? So it's a very common thing. You can imagine we inhale viruses, or viruses occupy, they come through our orifices, our mouth, our nose, our ears, even maybe, I don't know. And where do they, if they come through the upper respiratory system, where do they go? Into the lung, right? I mean, if you're unlucky, if your immune system is off guard and lets them through and doesn't close the door here, some of them may get down into your lung, and lo and behold, they may make you trouble. And primarily, they affect the alveoli, which we've said before, right? People very early on, when they looked at COVID-19, they said, oh, it affects the alveoli, and that's why it's troublesome, because in the alveoli, the oxygen exchange takes place, and that's exactly why it's dangerous, right? Because you may asphyxiate if you have that inflammation, that condition, right? But that's true for all pneumonias. So this pneumonia isn't any different in any specific way, except it's triggered by this one particular virus, yes. But otherwise, it's just a plain vanilla pneumonia, right? So everything you read about pneumonia here applies, basically, right? At least for the viral pneumonias. Maybe the bacterial pneumonias may be in some ways a bit different. I'm not an expert on pneumonia, and I don't claim to be, but I'm just saying, logically speaking, you can just read up on pneumonia and it tells you what COVID-19 is, right? And it's quite interesting and surprising that how little, even on like Wikipedia or other media, people make that connection. So here you see, when you read, you see, oh, weak immune system. Yeah, exactly what we've been saying, right? You get a pneumonia if your immune system is compromised, right? I call it compromised, they call it weak, but we mean the same thing. And both terms, compromised or weak, are not very specific, right? It could be any number of things that have weakened your immune system, right? And I've been arguing the primary thing that is of concern, if it's too slow, because new virus comes, it takes some time to get to know the virus. And if it's too slow to develop the right neutralizing antibodies, the virus will have a lot of time to get through into the lung, right? Even though it doesn't want to, but it will just slip through, right? Just because the immune system is slow. So when I've been talking about a compromise, or as they call it, a weak immune system, the primary concern is that it's slow. Yeah, slower than it needs to be, right? So and because it's slow to produce the right antibodies, the virus gets into your lung. And then there's a secondary effect, a weakness, if you like, of the immune system, which is it may then, once it's here and makes trouble, it doesn't make us trouble here, but it makes us trouble down here because of the alveoli, because of the oxygen exchange there. So the inflammation of the alveoli is a bad thing because it affects our breathing. And they make us trouble there. And the secondary weakness of the immune system may then be that it reacts wrongly. May overreact, underreact, misreact in various ways, cytokine storms, and I think we've talked about some of those things, how the immune system can misreact. But the more compromised, in my word, the immune system, the more likely the virus gets down here, one, and the more likely the virus becomes really fatal or dangerous because your immune system then, when it is arrived here, doesn't do the right thing, right? And that's very complex, right? And I don't understand all those complexities myself, but the essential of it is very simple, right? There's two stages where the immune system is critical. One, it needs to prevent the virus from getting any further than your throat. Not into the bronchs and certainly not into the lung. Even in the bronchs, it can lead to a bronchitis or something like that, which can, in some cases, be a severe illness, right? So the best is to stop them here, right? And the worst case is you don't, and it gets all the way down into the lung and colonizes the lung, right? So that's the first task of the immune system, is to prevent that virus from getting any further than your throat. The second task, if the virus did slip through, and that can happen to anybody, even someone with a perfectly healthy immune system, right? So it's just, again, probabilistic game. If you're perfectly healthy, you're just much less likely that it will happen, but it's not, the likelihood is never zero, right? Okay, so let's say it did get through, then the immune system has a lot of work to do to deal with that inflammation of the lung, and that's complicated. And there, a lot of things can go wrong. And what we call a compromised immune system, what we mean by that, it's an immune system that is somewhat more likely to get things wrong because it's old or because it's already been handicapped by some other chronic disease that that person may have, etc. Right? Again, this is complex, and I don't claim to know all the complexities, but the basics are very simple. Right? If you have a healthy immune system, it makes it very unlikely that the virus gets through. And if the virus gets through, it will probably allow the pneumonia that you develop to be a relatively mild pneumonia, right? Because it does the right things and clears it away in like a matter of a couple of weeks, and you're better, right? Conversely, if you have a compromised or weak immune system, you're less likely to prevent the virus from slipping through. And when you develop a pneumonia down here, you're less likely to be able to deal with it well. And then you may become one of those cases who have severe breathing problems and need intubation. And by the time you're on intubation, on intensive care, IC, your likelihood of dying is already what, 30% or so, right? Or more even, right? So there you're then really in danger, right? That's what we mean by weak immune system, okay? And what they're pointing out, you have that for any kind of pneumonia, it doesn't matter which virus triggered it, right? But here comes the interesting bit. When they talk about vaccines, so in the upper part, they don't talk about COVID at all, even though it's on everybody's mind, but nobody bothers to say, oh, by the way, COVID, yeah, there's a pneumonia here for you. But here, where they talk about vaccines to prevent certain types of pneumonia, such as those caused by this bacteria linked to influenza, or those linked to COVID-19 are now available. So the person who wrote this has fully understood that COVID-19 is a pneumonia, right? Why isn't this person speaking up? Well, maybe he is, I don't know, he or she, right? I don't know, but see, there are people in the profession probably, or people like me who just sort of general interest people, who have I didn't write this, okay? So I've never written anything on Wikipedia. So, but someone went in and said, oh yeah, and so far as vaccines are concerned, we have vaccines for certain types of pneumonia, for example, COVID-19. So that person has fully understood that COVID-19 is a pneumonia. So you do wonder, do our politicians, or rather their advisors, do they ever read Wikipedia or similar sources? I mean, why isn't anybody waking up to the fact that this is just a pneumonia? And why aren't people talking about it that way? I just don't get it, right? So yeah, that's why I talk about it, but nobody listens to it. So pneumonia affects 450 million people globally, 7% of the population. I was surprised. I thought that was a large number. I would have thought it would be less, but there do seem to be mild pneumonias. So, because I was thinking, I'm not conscious that I've ever had a pneumonia in my life, right? But first of all, what you had as a child, you may not remember, right? You would have to ask your mother or your father or someone who close to you who might know. But I think there's probably a lot of pneumonias which aren't so severe. And you may not even need hospitalization, you may not have some breathing difficulties for a short time and then it goes away. So I mean, 7% of the global population, that seems like a very high number, but that probably includes symptoms that aren't that dramatic, where you're not even sure, am I just having a severe cold, or is this a pneumonia, or is this a bronchitis, right? You can mix them up too. So I know I've had bronchitis, yeah, but pneumonia, I'm really not aware. And if 40-50 million globally, 7% of the population every year, yeah, each year, then I should have, statistically, I should have had pneumonia several times in my life. I just don't know that I did, right? So I find this number a bit high. But, if you include mild cases where you may not be aware that it's a pneumonia, then, yeah, maybe, right? Which may mean also for COVID-19 that, I've been always talking in a binary way. I said, either you have a cold or you have pneumonia. Pneumonia is serious, right? Hospitalization. For me, pneumonia, meaning COVID-19, equals you need to be hospitalized, right? The reality may be that they're intermediate cases, right? That some people, some amount of virus gets through into the lung, but it doesn't create a big inflammation. It doesn't, immune system reacts well, and maybe you have you experience some breathing difficulties for a little while, but not too severe, and maybe you never actually end up in hospital at all, right? And actually, you did have a pneumonia. So maybe it's not just black and white, but maybe shades of gray, I guess is what I'm saying, right? Otherwise, I could not really explain this large number of pneumonias every year. And they result in 4 million deaths. Yeah, so that would be a very low fatality for pneumonia, right? So my definition of pneumonia has been stricter. It's like hospitalization. Remember I said, once you're hospitalized, you have a 20%, 1 in 5 chance of dying, right? This one is a 1 in 100, right? 1% fatality rate of pneumonia. So they must have a very broad definition of pneumonia. Okay. I'm not here to argue with the definition of pneumonia, and anyways, they're not giving it. Well, there are footnotes, by the way, that I've just removed, so you may want to read it up in the original, because there are footnotes and they may give you interesting additional information. I just haven't bothered. But about 4 million deaths, and I've had more recent. This is probably a little bit old, this data, because more recently the last number was 2.7 million. So as I said, it's trending down. Yeah, so 4 million was maybe like 10 or 15 years ago. But it's a tangible number. So if you think about our COVID fatalities, we will talk about it in a moment, 9 million as of today of COVID fatalities according to my model, over 18 months, right? So annualized, that would be 6 million at the moment, 6 million pneumonia fatalities per year. So if the traditional number was 4 million, that is 50% more than in a normal year. On that, that 6 million comes on top, right? Maybe not entirely, because you can imagine that the pool of people are the same, whether they get, pneumonia from SARS-CoV-2 or whether they get pneumonia the other way. It's the same pool of people with the same underlying health issues and compromised immune system. So to some degree, the COVID pneumonia supersede those 4 million, other pneumonias. Right? You can't die twice of pneumonia. And someone who dies of COVID-19 pneumonia could as well have been a candidate to die of another type of pneumonia, you see, because the characteristics of that person are such that they are candidate for dying of pneumonia if they contract one of these pathogens, right? So, so there will probably be an overlap, and a significant overlap even. So no, it's not that the 6 million COVID-19 pneumonia fatalities have to be added to the normal 4 million. I don't think that's the case, right? Maybe half of those 4 million, they are the same people in the same year even would have gotten a pneumonia. Yeah. I don't know, right? So, but they're not entirely additive, but it's very clear that there's a spike here, a significant spike in pneumonia fatalities in the last 18 months. There's no doubt, right? But this is all it is. It's a significant spike of pneumonia fatalities. That's all. I'm not saying we shouldn't deal with it. I'm not saying there are things we can do about it. Of course we can, but I'm just saying that's what it is and nothing else. Yeah? It's not something that came from outer space, and it's not some aliens, and it's not any, it's not anything dramatic. It's not anything unusual. It's not anything we can't deal with. If we could just get our politicians away from it, then, we would just deal with it. Our healthcare systems would just deal with it. And the last thing I highlighted is, I think I've shared this before, that there was this Canadian doctor in the early 20th century who said pneumonia is an old man's friend. And whether that was his invention or maybe that's something that people have been saying for hundreds of years. Right? Why? Because elderly people, if they're suffering of chronic pain, and remember, until not so long ago, we didn't have a lot of effective painkillers. Until about 100 years ago, we didn't really have very effective painkillers. We didn't have all this palliative medicine that we have today that makes life for people who suffer from chronic diseases that may generate a lot of physical pain. It makes it more bearable to them for a longer period of time, which is great for them. But in the olden days, until maybe 100 years ago, or even less, you were just suffering pain. If you had a cancer, let's say, or whatever, right? You were suffering pain, and there was not much the doctors could do to alleviate that pain, right? And so to be infected and develop a pneumonia and die within a matter of maybe a week, that could be a godsend for a person who was suffering severe pain, and it was not treatable and not curable, and it wasn't even amenable to palliative measures because they didn't have a lot of those. So that kind of suffering got short-circuited by pneumonias, and that's why that person said it's an old man's friend. Right? Times have changed. Today we have palliative medicine. We do have painkillers that I've had. I know times have changed, but I'm just saying that it's not so long ago that people thought of pneumonia as something, well, it ends your life relatively quickly, relatively painlessly. Of course, it can be terrible if you have breathing problems and nobody can help you, but you will die of it fairly quickly. So the pain is intense and the terror must be intense, but it's relatively quick. Today, we have a way of thinking about our health, which is you must survive as long as possible. And anything that extends your life is good. Yeah. What we're then not thinking of is that ever more elderly people crowd out ever more younger people because our resources and the planet is limited, et cetera, et cetera. Those things are not being taken into consideration. It's just, the longer you survive, the better, right? And actually, there was a time not so long ago when people said, no, not necessarily. Sometimes it's just better to, be liberated, right? So I know it's a dangerous territory. There's euthanasia discussions. I'm not going into those. I'm not advocating anything like that. The only thing I'm advocating is to have an open mind. Things aren't black and white. To die of pneumonia isn't the worst thing that can happen in a life, okay? To get this hysteria around this pneumonia is unexplainable to me. Yeah? It is by no means a cause for hysteria and for manias and for madness. And unfortunately, that's what we're experiencing right now. And for no good apparent reason. Okay. More on, let me see, on pneumonia. Yeah, I just talked about, this is the viral version. Rhinoviruses, coronavirus, you can already see those are the typical common cold viruses, right? And then influenza virus, so it's all known, and there are a few others. Immunocompromised persons, same story again. Different viruses predominate at different times of the year. During flu season, influenza may account for more than half of all viral cases. So I think what they're saying is common cold season and flu season aren't the same. In my thinking, I've sort of always bunched them together, but that's maybe not true, right? So it is not really that our immune system is very busy at some parts of the year and then not busy at all in other parts of the year. It's probably not true, right? There is a certain seasonality here, but different viruses overlay and in different ways, right? So it's not as clean cut maybe as sometimes I make it to be, right, in my very simplistic model, right? But there's a certain seasonality, certainly in Northern Hemisphere countries. If you're far enough away from the equator, you will have a seasonality to this. There's no doubt, right? See, and here, this is SARS-CoV-2 can also result in pneumonia. See, but here they're not calling it COVID-19, right? So earlier they said, oh, vaccine against pneumonia, yeah. If it's related to COVID-19, we have a vaccine now. Great. They say that earlier in the text. Here further down, they say, oh, SARS-CoV-2 can also result in pneumonia. But why don't they call, why don't they say comma, in which case that particular pneumonia is currently termed COVID-19? Why don't they say that? Because that's what we're observing, right? We've created this name, this acronym COVID-19 for a phenomenon that is basically a pneumonia, but we're not saying that. I don't know what it is that prevents us. Okay, then they're talking about, here's a bacterial pneumonia that has a mortality rate of around 25%. Now ours is a viral one and it may be different. But I did think, because I'm arguing the mortality rate is about 20% once you're hospitalized. That's based on empirical data with COVID-19. So I just wanted to say that's not so different, yeah. So that in a way confirms we're in the same order of magnitude. We're talking about the same types of phenomena, right? Then further down, they say persons requiring hospitalization, mortality may be as high as 10%, and if they go in intensive care, maybe 30% or even 50%. Yeah. So they are saying when you require hospitalization, it's only 10%. So I'm saying 20%, right? There they say up to 25%, but that's a certain type of bacteria. So that may be, I don't know, maybe tougher to handle for our immune system. I don't know. But our 20%, what we are assuming is that in the moment where you get hospitalized, 20% fatality, right? Hospitalizations are 1% of global population, IFR 0.2% or 20% of that 1% that gets hospitalized, right? So that, it hangs together. All I'm saying is here, those numbers are in the same ballpark, right? Which reconfirms us both that our numbers are roughly right, and secondly, that we are very likely correct when we call this a pneumonia. Right? And if you don't want to call it a pneumonia, you don't have to, but you just think of it, but it works just like a pneumonia. You can call it COVID-19, but it works exactly like a pneumonia. It actually is a pneumonia, if that's what I'm saying. But if those taxonomists don't agree, then let them do their thing. But for you can just think of it, this is just a pneumonia. And so the numbers are in that ballpark, right? Yes, it depends on which virus triggered it. Yes, because of the differences. I agree with that. And that's what they kind of say here. So, it ranges between 10% and 25% the mortality once you require hospitalization, but our 20% is within that. And it's based on empirical evidence. So it's not something that I made up, right? It's just that empirical evidence was last year and it was sketchy, just a couple of countries and just one point in time or 2 points in time. Remember, and I didn't go back and actually someone should have a model as to what are the actual hospitalizations and what are the actual fatalities in hospitalization, right? Someone should actually model that from the medical profession, but that's not me, right? I'm not going to do that work for the medical profession. They can please do that themselves, right? But someone or some researcher should be doing this, right? Build a model to figure out what is actually the real hospitalization rate and the real IFR, right? Mine are rough and ready assumptions, but as you know, they've not changed that much over the last 15 months that I've been keeping these videos going. And actually the model is 15 or 16 months old. I think June last year, I think I started the model. So, and it hasn't changed very much, right? So I'm very comfortable that I'm in the right ballpark. And I think these figures here, again, reconfirm, yeah, you're in the right ballpark. So our numbers are roughly right. And our assumption that this is a pneumonia, COVID-19 is a pneumonia, and SARS-CoV-2 is a common cold virus that can trigger, under certain circumstances, can trigger pneumonia. All of those assumptions, I think, are borne out by this stuff that I find on Wikipedia. Yeah. And the last point here I highlighted, because people have talked about long COVID, people love to create these scary sounding new ideas, right? Long COVID, oh, if you get COVID, it may turn into something that haunts you for a long time, not just for that one cycle of inflammation that may take a few weeks and then hopefully you're recovered, but no, it can haunt you beyond it. It can have chronic implications. It can have organ damage that is lasting and so on. And all of that is true. Yeah, I have no doubt that all of that is true. But, that is true for any pneumonia. That's my point, right? There's nothing special about that. Right? They say about 10% of those discharged may have repeated or ongoing, effects from that pneumonia. 10% of all those who were hospitalized and then didn't die but get discharged, right? 10% of those may have long COVID. Yeah, there's no need to create these scary sounding terms because it's always so. Pneumonia is a severe illness that challenges our physical system, our immune system, and other parts of our physical system significantly, and it can lead to these types of complications. Yeah, totally agreed. It's just no need to invent long COVID because nobody talks about long pneumonia, right? Why not? Because nobody cares. But in the moment where people call it COVID, everybody cares. That is the part I don't understand. This is just like any other pneumonia. Yes, if you're unlucky, you get hospitalized, you recover, but you may have some either a repeat event or some lasting, damage of some sort or another. That's possible. About 10% of those discharge. So if 1% of the world population needs to be hospitalized, that's 79 million people, of whom 20% die. So you have you have about 60-something million survivors. Of those, 10% may have long COVID, right? So that's what, 6 million. Yeah. But that's no different than any other pneumonia as well, right? So that's always been with us as long as humanity probably has existed, okay? All right, so that's just by way of completing this discussion about what is it that we're actually talking about when we talk about SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. We're talking about a common cold virus, a common cold coronavirus, and we're talking about, in a few cases, that common cold coronavirus triggers a pneumonia. This is, again, nothing new. The only thing that is different this time is that this virus is new to us, so we hadn't encountered it before, so our immune system is not prepared, and that's why a larger than usual portion of people have difficulties with it, the difficulty to prevent it from coming into the lung, and if it does get into the lung, difficulties dealing with it effectively, right? And that's just because this virus is new to us. Now, by definition, it will not be new to us for very long. Thankfully, the newness wears off, right? Our policies do everything we can to slow down that getting to know the virus, which is crazy. But no matter how hard our politicians work on, preventing us from getting to know the virus, we will all get to know this virus. Yeah. And what I said on my very first slide, that process of getting to know the virus and becoming comfortable with it, right, and living with it peacefully, may take a bit longer than I had anticipated. I'd always thought of 2 to 3 year kind of time frame for that, and now I'm saying, well, maybe it's 6 to 8 or even 10 years. Until all of us, humanity, has been sufficiently exposed to this virus to really are comfortable with it in all its different variants and whatever is yet to come, even future variants. Because remember, a variant it's called a variant because it is in some important way different, but in most other ways it's not different, right? So you've encountered one variant, it does help you with the next variant, right? It doesn't help you 100% with the new variant, but it helps you a lot with the new variant. So the more of them you have encountered, the more your immune system will have this richness of information and knowledge and experience to leverage to fine-tune its response. Right? That's what we do with all common cold viruses. Yeah? That's why we don't normally talk about common colds, and we're not bothered by them, except, of course, our children have a headache and can't go to school, da, da, da. But, you know, why? Because our immune system just learns to live with it quite effectively without ever being able to exterminate it. Yeah. And that's what this is, right? But it may take 6 to 8 or 10 years for us to fully get to that. And the only worry there is that the politicians are unable to get out of their mindsets that they have to be at war with this virus and that they have to suppress this virus and exterminate this virus, which is not possible. And it's not even necessarily desirable, at least not at any like cost of the type of cost that we are putting on ourselves in this war on the virus. The costs are way higher than the benefit, right? Even if we were to exterminate this virus, it's just a common cold virus. It will not, in the long run, be a benefit to us to have exterminated the virus. And the costs are humongous. So there's absolutely no angle from which it makes sense to try to exterminate this virus, okay? But as long as the politicians don't change their mindset, remember my Copernican revolution I talked about a couple of times? Yeah, they have to basically put themselves upside down. They're all like making a headstand right now, and they're thinking of the world the wrong way around. You know, they have to turn that upside down. And as long as they don't do that, we will have this trouble. We will have these crazy policies, these suppressions of our rights, these suppressions of our freedoms, just because these people do not think. Yeah, that's my worry, that will carry on for a while and maybe longer, unfortunately, than I had originally expected. Okay, we will see. I'm not a crystal ball glazer. We'll see what the policy developments will be. Right? Hard to predict, but there is one scenario that this carries on longer because it just takes us longer to get to know this virus than maybe I would have thought. That's all I'm saying. That doesn't mean it will take longer. I'm saying it could take longer. Okay, to our monthly prizes, the Silly Monkeys Prize for steps taken towards destroying our humanity. I was hoping to actually sort of get away from these prizes again, because I think I made the points and it's very repetitive. So hopefully over the next few months, I can sort of phase this out. I don't want to carry on forever on this, but in this month, I still have a few candidates, and maybe I will have the occasional candidate that in the future that I will bring up. But you can see that the number of finalists are getting fewer and fewer. Because there's not so much new under the sun. It doesn't mean that the same mistakes are not being repeated. They are all the time, but I just don't feel it makes any sense to keep reporting the same mistakes. Right? Since the reporting, if I report it, nobody listens anyway, so there's no point, right, to keep repeating the same type of mistakes that are being made. So this first one I want to report is just that, remember a month or two ago, I had President Macron win this Silly Monkey Prize. I think he shared the Silly Monkey Prize with someone else, but you know, he was awarded the prize because he was trying to push through a health pass / vaccination pass framework in France, which many people, including people in France, not just me, think is unconstitutional because it limits people's freedom and it is discriminatory, right? Basically, it discriminates between people who are vaccinated and people who are not vaccinated. Which in the bigger frame of things that makes no sense, as I said before, because most of us anyways get naturally exposed, and even the vaccination doesn't change that very much, right? So in the short term, it accelerates an exposure, that's true, but that's all it does, right? So there's no sensible way to support a policy that permanently, apparently, suspends human rights because of a vaccination that for almost all of us is irrelevant. And even for those where it is relevant, they would have sooner or later been exposed to the virus anyway. So that, the vaccine doesn't change who you are and, how mobile you are allowed to be. It doesn't have any impact like that at all. So to have legislation that discriminates between people who are and who are not vaccinated is complete nonsense, right? And this is, in my mind, completely against any constitution, right? So the reason I'm reporting it again is because the Constitutional Court of France approved Macron's idea or proposal. It says they cut out a few clauses, and I don't know the details, right? So there were a few clauses that they did feel were unconstitutional, but the overall framework they approved, meaning they did not find it unconstitutional to discriminate between people who are vaccinated and people who are not vaccinated. There are certain things that they said that is going too far and you're not allowed to do that. But in principle, they have approved the idea that the state can, and private sector can discriminate between people who are vaccinated and people who are not. And I think that's, in a country like France, I said before, I mean, this is one of those countries that prides itself of being the cradle of democracy and human rights, whether or not they are, but I think they pride themselves of that. This is shocking, right? And I find this more shocking than Macron proposing it, because a politician will do these things, right? But a constitutional court, if there's any institution in any country that I personally would have some amount of trust in, and I'm not very trusty of any institutions generally, but if there's one where I have a high degree of trust in that institution, it is usually the Constitutional Court. And to see a Constitutional Court of a country like France approve this blatant discrimination that makes no sense, by the way, but even if it did make sense, I wouldn't agree with it anyways, right? Because it's just not constitutional. I mean, you know, at least I know the German basic law, and I haven't read the French one, but, you know, I can assure you this would be unconstitutional under the German. Still, the Germans may do the same. Right? And the German Constitutional Court may also approve it, you see? So this is shocking. Right? And then I thought it was rather funny what Macron said to a newspaper. A few tens of thousands of people have lost their minds to such an extent that they say we live in a dictatorship. No, these few 10,000 are the only ones who haven't lost their mind, because of course they're completely right. Of course they're living in we all live in a dictatorship now, all of us. So I thought it was really funny that Macron would bring this up. He just doesn't get it at all, right? He thinks he can say this, and he probably means it. It's not a joke, right? I mean, politicians, they normally don't joke, right? So he doesn't mean it as a joke. He means it seriously. He really believes that those people who say we are living in a dictatorship, that they are mad. The opposite is true, Mr. Macron. They're the only ones who aren't mad. All right. So this is a nice final list. Second finalist, California. The state of California in the US becomes the first US federal state to require vaccinations for all school staff. So this is new in so far, I think, I mean, maybe happening somewhere else too, but the Macron stuff and stuff generally in Europe has been either, if you want to enter a certain venue, then you have to show that you have been vaccinated, or it has been the medical profession where they did sort of these kind of blanket vaccination requirements, right? But you now have the state saying school staff has to be vaccinated. So, okay. To address the number one anxiety that parents like myself have for young children. Young children have virtually zero trouble with COVID. Mr. or Mrs. Newsom. That's complete nonsense, right? The parents are not supposed to have anxieties, and if they have anxieties, that's their personal business, right? Let them have anxieties, but it's certainly not the state, the federal state's role to feed those anxieties with this kind of discriminatory policy. Right? Yeah. Polling indicates that nearly 90% of educators have been vaccinated. Yeah, so, but no, you have to force everybody else as well, right? And if you don't vaccinate, you lose your job. And this is in the United States of America, another one of those countries that claim to be the cradle of democracy and human rights, right? Forget it. And now they go to the Taliban in Afghanistan. You must adhere to human rights. They have zero credibility. Zero. They complain that in Afghanistan, the women have to wear like a burqa. Yeah, I don't like that either, but they don't understand that, for example, in Singapore, every human being has to wear a mask. When you step out of your door, you have to wear a mask, 100%. That's worse than Taliban. You might say, no, but that Taliban is discriminatory between the genders. That's true. Whereas the mask wearing in Singapore is everybody, irrespective of gender. So it's gender neutral. That's true. But even more people are affected by that. And not only in Singapore, right? I'm just saying that because I happen to know that it is the case, right? I experience every day. But I'm sure there are other countries where you step out of your house, you have to wear a mask. And the same people who order those kinds of policies are then the ones who say, oh, but the Taliban, they will force the women to wear a mask. Burqa being a kind of a mask, right? No, you can't have it both ways. If you want to ever again wag your finger against another country who's not adhering to basic rights, you first have to get your own house in order, right? And California has now taken a step in the opposite direction, right? California is going Taliban, basically, right? Discriminating between vaccinated and unvaccinated. That's no better than discriminating between women and men, right? It's no better than that, right? It's just the same thing, right? Discriminating one group against another group. So California is going Taliban, and the whole world is going Taliban. Right? Incidentally, the Taliban do not require anybody to wear a medical mask. They don't. Actually, Afghanistan is more liberal than most of the world in that respect. Yeah? I'm not here to defend the Taliban. I'm not a fan of the Taliban. I'm not paid by the Taliban, and I actually don't know any single Taliban, I don't think. But I observe on the TV that they don't force people to wear a facial mask. Yeah, so before you blast them on their rights issues, and I'm sure they have plenty of rights issues, you start with your own rights issues. Yeah, and the world right now has plenty of human rights issues at your doorstep. So please start at your doorstep and not somewhere far away. New Zealand, okay, my third finalist. So, okay, the pandemic strategy in doubt because of Delta just being a bit more quicker, right? One thing I thought was interesting, the reality though is that the virus can be infectious within 24 hours of someone getting it. Yeah, but that's not new. So they're now, someone is now having an agenda apparently, which, people have, right? Where they might say we want to, some people are now pushing to go away from this policy of complete submission of the virus, and they use the Delta variant as a what's the word? As a reason, right? Oh, because it's faster, so our old policy didn't work, right? It's nonsense, right? Yeah, it is faster, but the old policy never worked. It could not possibly have ever worked, right? Under no circumstances. So even if you had completely eradicated the virus in New Zealand, that's theoretically possible. Yeah. Even if you had done that, the policy would have failed, right? Because you could never, ever again open your borders. I mean, I hope nobody is seriously suggesting that that is even something they could fathom. And in the moment, and if it's in 100 years' time, in the moment you open your borders again, boom, the virus will be there, right? So it could never succeed, right? So, you could argue, if the whole world had jointly gone into lockdown, complete and utter and, without exception, into lockdown at the same time, then the virus could not have gone anywhere. Yeah, that's even theoretically possible. But try to get, 7.9 billion people to go into a complete lockdown at the same time. Theoretically, that's possible, but practically, that would not have happened. And that would have been the only physical way to prevent the virus from spreading anywhere at all. Right? If everybody goes into complete lockdown for, let's say, 2 to 3 weeks, then the virus cannot have gone anywhere anymore. Right? And you could potentially have eradicated it. Right? But as I say, eradication of this virus is not necessary. It's not relevant. Right? It's just common cold virus. It doesn't matter whether we have 200 or 201. Common cold virus. It really doesn't matter. So this whole idea that this virus needs to be eradicated was wrong anyways, right? Even if it was feasible, right? And those people who think, oh, it is feasible, they are completely deluded. Yeah. And if they think it's feasible within my little country, yes, but then it means you can never, ever again open your country. I mean, have you thought about that, people? So no, there is no way you can suppress this virus in any way that is not completely ahuman and anti-human. Right? So I'm not arguing with these doubts that people put on this, right? But I'm arguing with, this should never, in a country like New Zealand, where, until recently I thought it was like a Western democratic kind of country. No, it's not, obviously. These people are obviously all sheep, right? Somebody told me there are more sheep than people in New Zealand, but no, they're only sheep in New Zealand. There are no people at all. Only sheep do this kind of thing. It's completely unthinking so-called strategy. That's not a strategy. That's just nonsense. Yeah? The strategy has always something that makes sense. Otherwise, it's not a strategy. Okay, so this month's Prime Minister Ardern announced that national borders will remain closed until the end of the year, and of course, and next year as well, and the year after, Mrs. Ardern, unless you do your Copernican revolution, please, right? And then she says, after that, the country would move to a new individual risk-based model for quarantine-free travel. I will show you an example of that in a moment, because there's a lovely example of that. But I'm just going to tell you, Mrs. Ardern, this is going to be the greatest nightmare for your 5 million sheep in your country that you could ever have created if you really go that route. I can already tell you that now, right, Mrs. Ardern? I'm challenging you to start switching on your brain. Yeah, you just try it. If you've never done it in your whole life, just try it now. Switch on your brain and start thinking. Okay. And the winner is, yes, it's our wonderful Jacinda Adolfine Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, for turning New Zealand into a concentration camp. I could have said into a sheep farm. Same thing. The sheep also get slaughtered, just like the people in concentration camps. So it's, yeah, I could have said sheep farm, but I call it concentration camp. Concentration camp is good because then I can give her a little Hitler mustache. Where's my Hitler mustache? There it is. Remember her colleague in Denmark got the Hitler mustache as well. And Merkel. Yeah. Somehow this Hitler mustache looks very good on ladies. Yeah, maybe we should make that a fashion statement. Anyways, this is Jacinda Ardern wins this month's Silly Monkey Prize for turning New Zealand into a concentration camp or a sheep farm. Okay, next prize, Lady Liberty, for steps taken towards regaining our humanity. Not that there is very much being done, unfortunately, but I have a Lifetime Achievement Award. It was announced recently that the Swedish Prime Minister Stefan Löfven is going to step down within the next few months to make way for a successor who will then challenge the next general election. Right? So Mr. Löfven has been Prime Minister for quite long. He has been head of the, I think, Social Democrat Party in Sweden for quite long, and he has decided to step away, make room for new faces. Whether that has to do with COVID or, I mean, he was suspended. He had a vote of no confidence, I think, in the summer over social housing questions. So I'm not interested in Swedish politics, but he announced for whatever reason he's stepping down, and I want to award a Lifetime Lady Liberty Award to him because he's the only, as far as I can see, the only political leader worldwide to have retained a COVID advisor who is actually able to think and who Mr. Löfven actually listened to. Right? I mean, there may be some politicians who have great advisors, but they evidently don't listen to them. So Mr. Löfven not only has a good advisor, he listens to him. And that, I think, that is very rare among politicians. And that's why I think he really does deserve a Lifetime Achievement Lady Liberty Prize for defending a little bit of humanity and of human rights and human freedoms. You remember I had already honored him last Christmas together with Anders Tegel, which is that advisor that I'm referring to. I thought about bringing Anders back here as well, but I don't want to be repetitive. This is a Lifetime Achievement Award because Mr. Löwen is stepping down. If Mr. Tegel at some point steps down, then maybe we'll give him a Lifetime Achievement Award as well. But on this occasion, it's for the Prime Minister. So thank you, Prime Minister. Okay. Thirdly, remember I introduced the Homeric Laughter Prize. I called it something slightly different last time, but basically for the most hilarious announcements. These can be government announcements, or they can be, World Health Organization or other kind of institutions making announcements that are just so hilarious that I just can't stop laughing around them. So I first, before I show you my list of finalists, I want to go back to the winner from 1st of July, which was the Government Ministry Task Force in Singapore. Remember, I said they basically, in the public, they said they were doing a Copernican revolution, basically. They didn't use that term, right? It looked like it, right? They were saying, we are going to shift gear, and going forward, we will treat this virus, SARS-CoV-2, as endemic, as opposed to pandemic, meaning we have realized that it doesn't go away and that we'll all sort of get to meet it sooner or later. And they said they would treat it more like influenza, COVID-19, the disease, they would treat it like influenza, right? Singapore can work towards a similar outcome for COVID-19 as what we do with influenza. Many people are infected by the flu every year, some get seriously ill, but we just live with it, right? And they said, and we will have some mechanisms, and it will be similar to how we monitor the flu, right? So it all sounded like, oh, on the surface, it sounds like here's a government that actually is starting to understand. I mean, other than Sweden, right, which has been understanding for the last 18 months. But other than Sweden, here's a government that starts publicly talking about, oh, we're starting to understand this virus. Good. I mean, you might think I should have celebrated them, but because I happen to know Singapore, I don't believe it. They say that, and they may mean it in the long run, but I've not seen any evidence on the ground that they're actually moving towards treating this like flu. None, right? Rather the opposite. So let me show you my update. So this is the winner from 1st July, and I'm just now going to show you an update just to show you why I found this ridiculous. I presented them with the Homeric Laughter Prize for ridiculous statements. Why did I find this ridiculous? Not because it's wrong. No, it's correct. But because they won't do it. That's why I thought it was ridiculous. To announce something that there's no way that they're actually going to treat this like a flu, at least not in the foreseeable future, not for a long time to come. That was the reason. And, I'm happy to be proven wrong, of course, as always, right? If they prove me wrong, hey, then I will give them, some other award maybe, but I don't see that at the moment. So here's what I see. So here's my update as of 1st of September. They have now announced for 8th of September a new concept for Germany. They also mentioned Brunei, but I don't know whether that's already fallen by the wayside. But for Germany, as a trial, they will start introducing quarantine-free travel as a first step towards opening, right? But look at what they're doing. On the far right, the table, they've categorized the world into 5 categories. And for each of those 5 categories, they have different policies. So you couldn't be much more complicated than that, right? And for Germany, where they say, oh, Germany is our guinea pig. I don't know why they chose Germany, and I'm not proud of it at all. I'm German, but I'm not proud of it at all because it probably means that a totalitarian state says, oh, Germany is closest to us of all those Western countries. That's why we picked it. So that's not a positive, honor to be selected by a country like Singapore as being close enough for them to be comfortable to make you the guinea pig. So that's a negative for Germany, but I'm afraid it's true, because Germany has been totalitarian around this whole thing, more than most other European countries. But that's just by you know, as an aside, right? But so they picked Germany and they said, okay, for the Germans, here's the step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 step process the traveler will have to go through to avoid quarantine, right? And in Singapore, quarantine means 2 weeks in a hotel at your own cost, right? So there's also significant, if you have a family of 4, then, you know, you're talking $8,000 or so just for the quarantine, right? Not talking about the inconvenience and so on, right? So, so they say, if you go through these 6 steps, then you will be not required to go into quarantine, right? And they involve 4 PCR tests along the way, 4. And I'm like, why not 10 or 20? Or why not one every 1 hour? You know, I mean, how crazy can you be, right? I mean, I don't know. It doesn't matter, right? I mean, you know, any PCR testing is crazy unless it's in a diagnostic situation in a hospital, as I said before, right? But here, so 4 times you get PCR tested, and there are lots of conditions and lots of things and lots of limitations and lots of things apply. And it's a nightmare to try to actually plan a vacation with this kind of a list, right? But my main point is, why am I? Yeah. My main point is, if the Singapore government was serious about treating the SARS-CoV-2 infection just like a flu virus infection, then none of these things would exist, right? Because for a flu, we don't do any of that. We just let it be, right? And I already said earlier this year that my guess is by the end of this year, we'll be at a point where we have more influenza fatalities worldwide than COVID fatalities. Now, I may be wrong. Maybe I was, as I said, I was maybe a bit optimistic about, you know, how long this stretches, etc. But I'll show you in a moment, 70% of the world population, probably according to my calculation, have already been infected with this virus, right? So we are at the tail end. But for Singapore, this is the first step towards an opening. So Germans will want to travel to Germany at Christmas, not so much before, some businessmen and so on, but so you will have a significant number of travelers from Singapore to Germany only by Christmas, right? So that's 3 months away. And then they will want to see how it goes, right? They come back, okay, how many of them bring the virus along, They will want to have some kind of empirical data. So the soonest they can actually then act on whatever they learn from this experiment, they think of this as a humongous experiment. Yeah, they think of this as, oh, you can see how they fine-tuned this, and you know how many government officials must have worked on this to work this out. It's tremendous, right? But yeah, so for them, this is an experiment, a scary experiment, right? And the soonest they will have like tangible results from this will be a few weeks after Christmas. So meaning by February, let's say, Chinese New Year. So let's say sometime after Chinese, well, maybe Chinese New Year, maybe for them as a target, where they say, well, we need to open travel to some destinations where Chinese New Year travelers want to travel. So we'll see. But no earlier than February would they be in a position to take any of the learnings from this. And by the way, the learnings will be 0. Obviously, right? You can learn nothing from this that you don't already know, right? I mean, they could just ask me, Matthias, tell us what will happen. I could tell them, right? So this probably costs millions of dollars, and I mean the amount of frustration among travelers is unmeasurable, right? Where you know exactly what's going to happen, right? Yeah, a few people will happen to have been infected just the other day, right? And so they will test positive, right? A certain subsegment of those travelers will have tested positive in the last 72 hours, or they may even, upon arrival in the airport hall, they may infect themselves from someone else who is working there, right? And then they test positive. Yeah. So what? You learn nothing from that, nothing. But the way I interpret this, and I may be wrong, right? But the way I interpret this is they are making this a guinea pig, a test case with Germany. And the soonest, logically, they could have any results at all, any empirical data from this at all would be February. And again, that data, whatever data, it will be meaningless. It will not teach them anything that they don't already know. But okay, so be it, right? They don't understand that. Okay, but before February, they will not even have data. So they, so if they're thinking of this as a first step, and then we'll see how it goes, and then after that we take the next step, means the second step can only really happen in February next year, the earliest. And I don't know what that next step would be. Maybe add a few countries that are somewhat similar to Germany, so expand the whole, or make some refinements. Oh, maybe we don't need 4 PCR tests, maybe 3 PCR tests are enough, right? I mean, those are the types of improvements that civil servants make, right? It's totally incremental, marginal, and meaningless kind of improvements, right? And then they pat themselves on the shoulder. We did such a good job. We reduced from 4 to 3. That's a 25% reduction. Right? So, point being, I think what this demonstrates is that I was right. And again, I'm happy to be proven wrong still, right? I mean, the government may still change their mind or do different, all possible. I'm not a soothsayer, right? I'm just saying, 2 months ago, when I gave them a prize, I said, I don't see it happening. I don't see them treat the SARS-CoV-2 virus like a flu virus for a long time to come. Right? That was my argument to give them the prize. So that's why I thought it was ridiculous, that announcement, even though it's correct in terms of the content of it. Someone has actually understood the thing in the government, right? But they're not going to act on it, right? Because they're not comfortable acting on it because they're afraid that the population may not go along and so on. So they'll do it in small, like deaths by 1,000 cuts, they call it in Chinese, right? So they will do it like salami tactics, we call it in the West, right? So this is first salami slice, right? And at the speed that I just outlined, I mean, that it will take 4 months or 5 months for them to actually learn anything. If there was ever anything to learn from this, it would only be in 4 or 5 months. If their experiments that they're setting up have a 4 or 5 months time horizon each time before they go to the next, it will take decades until they treat SARS-CoV-2 just like a flu virus. So what I said at the very beginning, that it may take humanity 6 or 8 or 10 years to fully adapt to this new virus, Singapore will take even longer at the current speed. So yay, I think it's a very well-deserved prize that I gave them in July. This was just meant to show to you what I meant when I said, I don't see it happening. You wouldn't do any of this for flu virus. You would do nothing. You don't discriminate travelers. You don't ask, have you been vaccinated against this? There are like 4 major strains in influenza. Nobody asks you, have you been vaccinated against all 4 strains? Nobody does it, right? So none of this would happen if they treated it like an influenza virus. But they don't. And at this speed of change, their Copernican revolution will take decades. It's very slow motion Copernican revolution. Okay, but this is not my winner this month, because I have actually a finalist this month. It just came through the press yesterday. And it's a bit related to what Singapore has announced. So the Australians are, 2 months later, aiming to live with virus instead of eliminating it. Move away from a suppression strategy. We have thrown, says the Victorian Premier. So Victoria is a state of Australia. Australia has a federal structure, just like Germany or the United States. And the federal states have a premier. So this is the Premier of the state of Victoria, Daniel Andrews, who says, we have thrown everything at this, but it is now clear to us, that we are not going to drive these numbers down, that they're instead going to increase. So it took him 18 months. We knew this 18 months ago that you can't suppress this virus. Right? It took him 18 months and a lot of pain and a lot of damage to Australia, to the people of Australia, to figure out something that was obvious 18 months ago. The old playbook did not work, they say. There was no playbook. It was madness. It's called madness. This, not playbook. All right. So, moving on. Here's Mr. Daniel Andrews. Looks like a really nice guy. Obviously not very bright, but yeah, he's been asleep the last 18 months. He's just woken up. So he's my winner this month of the Homeric Laughter Award, and I've redesigned the award. It's this kind of dunce cap that in old England, in the classroom, if you were the one in the class who everybody was laughing about, they would give you this hat and put you in the corner of the room, and you would have to stand with the face against the wall and say, "I'm stupid, I'm stupid, I'm stupid." I love these Victorian educational methods. So we will, since he is from Victoria, we will apply a Victorian educational method to Mr. Andrews here. And we will give him, for having slept the last 18 months and just woken up, yay, we'll give him a dunce cap. Well done. So normally at this stage now, we would get into our Homeric laughter chart. Remember that Homer from that Simpson family laughing, yeah? You can find it here. I show you here the link. You know, you can find it there if you want. It is so amusing, right? It's just but I was thinking about doing laughter meditation. You know, there's actually such a thing as laughter meditation, and I've done it a couple of times with someone I know who is actually really good at doing laughter meditation with people. I'm not going to facilitate you now through a laughter meditation, but actually it is fantastic. So if you ever have a chance to do laughter meditation, I recommend it strongly, and it suits very well for any of these Homeric laughter situations, right? Where people just say ridiculous things like Mr. Andrews, "Oh, after 18 months, we have realized our old playbook didn't work." Yeah, so I thought about doing a laughter meditation with you, but I don't think I'm good at facilitating that. So I will instead just take 1 minute of normal meditation. So I will just close my eyes, sit upright, put the sole of my feet on the ground, feel the energy running through me. And I'll just relax and just give me 1 minute to take a few big, deep breaths. And I invite you to do likewise. Welcome back. Okay. Quote, "If someone who cannot swim blames the water for it, he is insane." Sachsenspiegel is a German law book from the early 13th century, very influential in most German lands until the early 20th, believe it or not, until the early 20th century. In some parts of Germany, the Sachsenspiegel, or paragraphs from the Sachsenspiegel were still used in law. So a highly successful law book. And it says, if someone who cannot swim blames the water for it, he is insane. If someone whose immune system does not work properly blames the virus, or even worse, blames his fellow citizens around him for it, he is also insane. Okay, COVID-19 scenarios. Where are we? Same place as every month. Sadly, we are not going anywhere. Deep into the fractured world. Deterioration, the severity of COVID-19 or the deterioration of our immune system is moderate. The effectiveness of our global response is atrocious. And that scenario we call fractured world, remember? Okay, talking about some data, my model. So as you know, we are progressing towards a near 100% penetration of SARS-CoV-2 infections. Everybody will get it with very few exceptions. That's why I'm saying near 100%, because I cannot exclude the possibility there will be a few people who never get it, right? Of course, if they die tomorrow, they may not have gotten it. So, yeah, but basically everybody gets it, right? And we are now, as of yesterday, we are at 70% penetration globally. This is excluding China for the reasons I've explained before. The reported cases are about 3.4%. Is that correct? Yeah, of global population, but the calculated cases that I calculate on the basis of fatalities in IFR are already at 70%, 70, meaning 70% of the global population have been exposed and have been infected by this virus already. And that 70% is a factor of 23 times the reported number, which is just to show how meaningless these PCR test results are. Right? Because reported cases are only if you test positive on a PCR or similar test. Right? But the actual infections are 20 times higher. So to link your policies to a test that tells you essentially nothing is just nonsense. But that's what most governments do. Okay, in terms of fatalities, as you know, as I said before, global population, excluding China, 6.4 billion people or so, IFR of 0.2, meaning 0.2%, sorry, of the population means 12.85 million people are going to die of COVID if that IFR is correct. Right? It's just a mathematical number. Right? So the green line is our calculated COVID fatalities as of today, and it happens to be precisely 9 million, which is just about twice as many as reported. So the reporting of fatalities is obviously much more accurate than the reporting of cases, naturally, right? Because a fatality you can't easily overlook. And most countries have systems in place where they register fatalities anyways, right? And so all you have to do then is have to decide, could this be a COVID fatality? And you may have certain criteria, and the criteria may differ from country to country, but there's a way to figure out, okay, someone died, was this a COVID fatality, yes or no, right? So the room for error or for missing someone is much, much less than testing for an infection, because you cannot test everybody all the time. It's not possible, right? So it's always going to be only random, kind of more or less random. Sometimes it's not random. It's at borders or at airports or whatnot. You can test only a certain fraction of people at any given time, and so you can never capture most cases. Right? It's just not possible. No matter, some countries have massively rolled out testing, doesn't do anything. Other countries do less of it. Doesn't matter, right? But fatalities, of course, the accuracy is much higher. So what I'm saying is the true COVID fatalities, and of course, true and apostrophes, right? Nobody knows the true number, right? This is just a model, but the model true number of fatalities is about 2 times higher than the reported. Yeah, reported as of yesterday were about 4.5 million, and the calculated number based on my IFR is about 9 million. Yeah? And then you have a total excess mortality beyond the trend line. And so that curve I build on data that I collect usually just once or twice a year, where I look at reported excess mortality, and that excess mortality relative to the long-term trend line. And during COVID, that has gone up in many countries, not all countries. And so you then just simply assume that that extra excess mortality over the standard mortality, that's COVID related, right? And not COVID fatalities, they're already captured by the 9 million, but other fatalities that come about as a secondary effect of COVID policies, for example. Most of them are probably due to COVID policy, right? Lockdowns, people going crazy, people doing suicides, people not getting treatment that is urgent for them because hospitals refuse them, all kinds of things. And you can say some of them are operational in the healthcare system. They're not policy things, they're just unavoidable sometimes. So some of them are blameless. Some of them are just simply stupid policies that are totally blamable. So it's a mixed bag, okay? But be it as it may, it's about 4 million. And so the total excess mortality in conjunction with COVID has now passed that imaginary calculated line of total COVID deaths we should expect. Meaning by today, more people have died in relation to COVID than the illness itself would have killed. Yeah. So we've reached a point where even if the government could stop all COVID fatalities tomorrow, net, their policies would have killed more people than saved. And I pointed out before, those excess mortalities are among people who are on average much younger than the COVID fatalities. COVID fatalities are 79 on average or something, and they have maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years of life expectancy, given that by definition they're living with a compromised immune system, right? So those are people who have a very low lifespan. The people who are, in excess mortality figures, suicides, they can be teenagers. So the average life expectancy would be much higher than that of the COVID fatalities, right? So we are saving some people with a very short lifespan at the expense of killing people who have a much longer lifespan. So if you calculated this in lifespan, in statistically remaining lifespan for these people, the number of man years destroyed would be several times higher than the number of man years saved already by now. Yeah. So in other words, the policies are not just illegal and against the constitution and irrational and irrelevant and ineffective and all that. They kill people. They net kill lifetime. They kill more lifetime than they save. And we've reached that point. Now 18 months in, remember my headline, we've reached that point. Numbers can change. Next month, if I feel compelled to bump up my IFR a little bit, then the 12.85 number will go up, but basically we are there. Basically, we've hit that point where more people have been killed by governments than saved. Yeah? And far more lifetime has been destroyed than saved. And not even talking of the economic and other, impact of these policies. Not even talking of all those other things, just accounting for lifespan. Yeah, huge disaster. This could still turn out to be the greatest human catastrophe, or the human rights value. What's the word? The biggest crime against humanity is, I guess, what I want to say, ever. The COVID policies of all governments taken together, or most governments, over the last 18 months, may turn out to have been the biggest crime against humanity ever committed by humans. That's a question of definition, I know, and whatever you define to be a crime against humanity, and I don't want to get into that now. As far as I'm concerned, that's how it looks. We will do our final evaluation later. It's a bit too early, but that's where we're headed. Okay, mapping progressions. Remember, I had crafted this sort of theoretical curve, the green curve, which is a seasonal curve in a Northern Hemisphere country. I've modeled it on Sweden because I'm arguing Sweden is the country that is most natural in how it deals with the virus, most logical, and also most in tune with how the virus actually works. Because, as I said, the Prime Minister had an advisor, Anders Tegnell, who actually understood the virus early on, and the Prime Minister listened to him. So the Swedish policy framework was more in tune and in sync with how the virus actually works than that of any other country, as far as I can see. And so I used the Swedish fatality data to model the cyclicality, the seasonality of the virus, which is the green line. So that's my modeled line. And behind it, you see the actual Swedish reported fatalities. And Sweden is quite good, probably, at reporting fatalities. So the true COVID fatalities are not that different, probably, from the reported. So that's a good. In some other countries, that might not be the case, right? But in Sweden and also the other countries I've chosen to show you in a moment, the reported fatalities and the actual fatalities from COVID are not too far apart. So it's a good proxy. These data that provided by Worldometer is a good proxy. So what you see is that in the early stage in Sweden, there were more fatalities than you would have expected, probably in part because a lot of tactical errors were made. Then they kind of got through that, I think. And then in the winter wave, which is in the middle of the picture, Sweden was pretty much on the curve. Then in early January, the vaccines were coming, and they realized once you have the vaccines, if you then impose some measures, some restrictions on people's movement, and at the same time roll out the vaccine, you may actually really save some people, and it may actually be defensible in terms of human rights and the Constitution to actually temporarily limit people's rights a little bit and roll out the vaccine at the same time to get the maximum effect of the vaccine. So that's what Sweden did. By now they have lifted most of those restrictions again. So they were really, in the case of Sweden, I think they were really meant to be temporary, unlike most other countries where they are basically indefinite. And you can see the white space below the green curve, if you wish, is life saved, and it's a tricky notion, so I put it into astrophysics, but I don't want to go into that detail now. So there has been a positive effect of the combination of having some restrictions on mobility and a rollout of the vaccines. Okay, and now you can't see the curve very well, but we are now in 1st of September, and the curve is exactly where you expect it in Sweden, which is it's very low. Right, there are very few at the moment, very few fatalities. And autumn season coming, officially autumn starting on 21st of September, and evidence, suggests that from last autumn that yes, that's actually when fatalities start going up again, right? Fatalities have a time lag. Remember, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 2 weeks of time lag after infection, or even longer. So if in late September or early October, the fatalities start going up, means the infections started going up, 3, 4, 5 weeks earlier, right? So we are now already in the stage where the infections probably are starting to go up in Northern Hemisphere countries. And in 3 weeks' time, we will start seeing a real uptick in fatalities. Now, my argument has been where the vaccines come in is that in this autumn, we will expect the fatality number to be significantly lower than the green curve. Last autumn, it was sort of on the green curve in Sweden until they imposed those measures, because they just let it sort of be naturally, more or less. This year, this autumn, because they have by now vaccinated 60% or so of the population, and of course, as you talk about, most of those don't need it, and most of these vaccines are wasted. But even though some portion of those vaccinations do reach the right people, right? So let's say if they are neutral in terms of how they allocate it, then if they have 60% of the total population vaccinated, that means they also have 60% of those people who actually need the vaccination or benefit from it. There's 60% of those also vaccinated, right? So not 100%, but maybe 60% or so. Okay, so meaning you will get fatalities, but far fewer than last autumn. And that's what we're really now tracking. And I will continue over the next few months and maybe into next year. Maybe I can extend this graphic a little bit, and just to show that, we had sort of identified a certain cyclicality in Sweden, and we picked Sweden because it was closest to a natural progression. And it is a Northern Hemisphere country, which is where most of the population is located. So it's somewhat representative in that respect, not maybe in every respect, but in that respect, for a wider global population, right? And hopefully this autumn we'll see the real full impact of the vaccines, because fatalities will just simply be a lot lower than last autumn. That's what we're expecting to see. And next month, on 1st of October, when I report again, hopefully we will see a bit of that, right? Starting to happen. Okay, that's Sweden. In Germany, broadly similar, less impact in the first phase of the COVID-19, so below the green curve. Then yo-yo effect, shooting up in winter. Then the hammer was brought out, and there were massive interventions after Christmas. So then they lifted them a bit. They had a bit of another yo-yo effect in March. And then it went down into the summer, and now it's starting to creep up again, because I think they have lifted, relative to last year, they have lifted some travel regulations. So it's more easy now to travel around, at least in Europe. And people do travel around, and inevitably, if there's a lot of motion and a lot of activity, there will be more transmission. So you would expect a bit more transmission this summer than last summer. So last summer, people were very locked down in many places, so therefore very little activity. So this summer is actually maybe more typical, but definitely you'll see a bit higher numbers this year than last year. But yes, you can see in Germany so far the numbers are not much higher than the green curve suggests, the Swedish curve. So they're a bit higher than in Sweden, but not by a lot. And we'll see in autumn how it pans out. Next country, USA. I said, yeah, a similar pattern, but they never had like that very low activity that Sweden had during the summer. In the US, even during the summer last year, there was some significant activity. That may be because the US is so big and it's got different climate zones. And you may have parts of the US, such as maybe Florida, parts of Texas, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Southern California, and so on, where you don't have a strong seasonality at all, because the climate is already no longer that type of temperate climate. It's either tropical or subtropical or kind of desert type of climates. And in those, you wouldn't expect that same seasonality. That could explain why in a country like the US that covers different time zones, the northeast and the northwest of the country, they will have the typical northern hemisphere seasonal swings, and the southern states of the US may not, right? And so you get this kind of mixed picture here. So I think that's how I explained to me why in the US, even in the summer, there was always some significant activity. And now one could analyze this on a state-by-state level to see whether my theory holds water, but I haven't gone there. Okay. There's also generally more laissez-faire, especially in the states run by Republicans. So which suggests, that there's always going to be a little more activity. And so and the US has a relatively poor IFR because of many underlying health issues. A lot of people are obese, a lot of people have diabetes, not only in the US, but the US is typical there. And since those are also factors in addition to age that play into my model, the fatality rate in the US is anyways relatively higher than in some, for example, some European countries, although some of the European countries, on the other hand, have even more aged societies than the US. So, to some degree it balances out, but there are some differences. So, you can't do a direct country by country comparison because each country has a different set of demographics. But roughly speaking, the US is similar to Germany and Sweden, but the main difference is that during the summer, there's more activity. And they also had like Sweden and then belatedly Germany, they had a vaccine kick in, and the US was one of the earliest kick-ins, and you really see an effect here. But you also now see a little bit of vaccination fatigue. So in the US, the vaccination rate has reached maybe 60% or so, but it's sort of really slowing down. And there are quite a lot of people who say, I just simply don't want to be vaccinated. And we have had, in the last few weeks, we've had quite an upturn in fatalities again. But again, it's not higher than last summer, but it's round about similar to last summer, but it's also not lower. And so if you might think, hey, but with the vaccines now 60%, shouldn't these numbers this summer be lower than last summer? And yeah, you might say, yeah, actually they should be. But on the other hand, last summer was still early stage, and a lot of parts of the US have not fully yet even received the virus, right? So this summer now, the virus is everywhere. So maybe this summer is actually the more typical. However, having said that, yes, the vaccine, 60% of people vaccinated, it should, again, if they just randomly give the vaccines, it means 60% of those who actually benefit from the vaccine will also have received it, right? So yes, you might have expected the numbers to be lower, but they are what they are, right? And we'll see how it develops over the next few months. And then UK was my fourth country. They had a very hammering down and then yo-yo. They had like 4 or 5 waves, which are mostly self-made by the government, presented to the people. We make waves for you, and they all go, yay! Mr. Johnson, he's the wave maker. So quite wavy, yeah, and a big hammer after Christmas. To their credit, and I gave Mr. Johnson and his team credit for that, right? They were also among the countries having an early vaccine kick-in. They were also one of the few countries that realized maybe we give a single shot first because we get a lot of bang for our buck, so to speak. and then we give the second shot later, there's a risk to that because it wasn't quite known whether the second shot at that point really has any effect at all or not, right? Because the researchers hadn't researched it that way. So Mr. Johnson took a risk there. He took a call. I called that courageous and intelligent at that time, and I still do. But it was an outlier. Most other countries didn't do it that way. They did the regular, the double shot rhythm or sequencing that like 4 or 5 weeks between them that the manufacturers had recommended, right? So most governments played it safe, but it means the reach of getting the vaccine out to as many people as possible was less than in the UK, right? And I think the numbers here, in a way, bear out the UK government. They really got the fatalities down very steeply once they started rolling out. However, they also at the same time rolled out a massive new set of restrictions. So that's what I call hammer, right? So so it's not, we don't know how big was the impact of the vaccines and how big was the impact of that hammer. Vaccines being legal and hammers being illegal, right? So that's a big difference. But they definitely got the fatalities down. But you do see a little bit of a yo-yo effect now, because remember they called it Freedom Day last month. They opened up a bit, not 100%, but some significant opening up and reduction of the constraints on people's freedoms. And you do now start to see that the numbers are, going up above the green line, but not too significantly yet, which is credit to the high degree of vaccination rate. And if they did the right thing, I don't remember, but if they gave the vaccine predominantly to people above 60 or 70 and to people with those preconditions, then the yield of the vaccines would be higher than the overall penetration, right? And so there's a big difference between governments who gave the vaccine to the right people and governments who didn't, right? So you can't just look at the overall vaccination rate. It doesn't tell you that much, right? The question is, did they give them to the right people or not? And I think in the UK, by and large, they probably did. So yeah, so we'll see how it evolves, but so this is UK. In terms of time to herd immunity, remember I said I've now defined herd immunity 90%. And how many months is a country away from reaching that? And the herd immunity is composed out of natural immunization by actually being exposed to the virus itself and or by vaccination, right? And they overlap, of course, massively. The vast majority of vaccines have been given to people who already encountered the virus, so the vaccination is useless. But okay, but there is not a full overlap, so the vaccinations do come on top of that, right? And I've made some assumptions about how good a country is in terms of targeting the right people, right? And I'm not going to show you all these assumptions again. I think I've done in the past, and it's complicated, and there's a lot of subjectivity in there, so don't quote me on it. But you get a picture here, right? You get, remember, back to normal countries, they are not far away from reaching that 90% herd immunity. Muddled through countries, on average, are a little bit further away, and then the so-called new normal countries are furthest away. But this image is now starting to change, because some of the new normal countries, like Japan and Korea, have really massively accelerated rollout of vaccines. And they have to be credited, I guess, for that they've at least at some point recognized that vaccines do work, right? Especially if you give them to the right people, which they don't always do, but okay. But they can afford it, right? So they just give it to everybody, which is, of course, at the cost of countries which cannot afford that. So people die in some poorer countries because rich countries are splashing out vaccine to people who don't need it, right? This is a way of murdering people indirectly, right? This is what all these governments do, right? They already, in some governments, they're already giving a third shot, booster shot, they call it. In some countries, they are going down to like 2-year-olds. They want to vaccinate and all that nonsense. As long as there's a limited supply of vaccines, and maybe we are already past that stage actually, but as long as there are people who are like 60 or 70 years and older, or have diabetes or are obese, etc., in other countries who have not yet been able to get a vaccine, no country should be doing that. No country should be giving it to people where we know it's wasted anyways, right? While there are still people in other countries where we know it's not wasted. At least there's a good probability that it's not wasted. But we're doing that. So that's a way of indirectly murdering people by not giving them what they need and instead giving it to people who don't need it, right? That's happening all over the place, but we knew that already 6 months ago. We talked about it. We knew that would happen inevitably. because, remember I said, because we're doing it in a nation state level, which is the wrong level, right? Instead of on a global level. And so we can't optimize it, because each nation state does their own little mini optimization game in their little locality instead of having a global view. The virus is global. The virus is just superior to us in every single respect. Yeah, it's very sad. We're wasting our brain completely here. The virus doesn't have any brain at all, but it does the right thing. Anyways, we'll catch up with the virus eventually, I'm sure, but it will take a while. So that's the picture here. There are fewer and fewer countries now who are really far away from hitting that kind of herd immunity level. The Philippines seem to belong to that, is still far away. Egypt, which has low penetration according to official numbers, and even though I'm bumping that up as a multiplier, the penetration isn't that high, and at the same time, very few vaccinations taking place. Now, they may be very smart about the vaccinations, that I don't know, but Egypt is one of the countries on the list here that is still very far away from reaching herd immunity at the current. This is always at the current run rate, right, which changes every month, so take it with a grain of salt. Germany is slowed down because the natural immunization is very low, because they're micromanaging at the local level. It's terrible. So they're not allowing the virus to go around. That's why Singapore picked them, I guess, right? Yeah. But it means people are not exposed to the virus, and they get older every day, and therefore they get ever more at risk, although at a very slow rate, I admit. But I think it's just the wrong-headed strategy. But I've tried to tell that to Mrs. Merkel for 15 months, no, 18 months now, and okay, she doesn't listen to it. But Germany is quite slow, and also the vaccination, they have a good penetration, I guess, but vaccination has now slowed down. And I'm not sure they have been very targeted and segmented with the vaccinations. So yeah, so they're still quite far away from herd immunity in Germany. But generally, the trend is getting closer and closer. Yeah. Here, nothing has changed, right? So I don't need to repeat myself. I've argued that Homo sapiens is dead, right? Sapiens meaning, wise and thoughtful. I've renamed us in a preliminary way, and I open the floor for proposals and for ideas, but I've called us for now Homo stultus, which means mad or silly or stupid. So we are Homo stupid. And instead of Pax, P-A-X, which stands for people, I'm talking of CAX, C-A-X, which stands for cattle. Since we're all being treated like cattle, we may as well call it out and not call ourselves people anymore, but cattle, because that's how we're being treated. But okay, so the figures and the logic of this hasn't changed, so let me move on. Same here. Okay, the policy mania, 9 million deaths, 12.85 million expected deaths from COVID, 13.08 already now total excess mortality. Remember I said earlier, that number is now greater than that second number, meaning there is a net loss of lives due to policy, right? And the number of people or cattle that can be saved, which at this moment is 3.85 million. If the government could stop fatalities tomorrow, they would have saved 3.85 million relative to the theoretically calculated number that would naturally occur, given the IFR assumption. So they would have saved 3.85 million lives. But every day, now that someone dies, this number gets smaller, right? So next month it will be smaller, and then the next month it will be smaller. So that number is trending down as our total COVID fatalities get ever closer to the 12.85 million, right? At the same time, the total excess mortality keeps going up. So the number on the bottom right, the 4.08, who I say a net sort of fatalities due to policies and actions on part of governments. And it may have some things that nobody can be blamed for in it. I admit that, and it's very difficult to divvy that apart. But there are certainly a lot of things in there that were completely avoidable if people had just thought about what they're doing. So that number, 4.8 million, now is bigger than the 3.85. And over the next few months, the 3.85 number, which is people saved, goes down. And the 0.08 number, which is excess people killed, goes up, right? So the disparity will get just ever bigger. Vaccination mania, I've made a little change. I used to say 1% because that's the number of hospitalization, and I was arguing those people who need hospitalization, they really benefit from the vaccine, because with the vaccine, they wouldn't need hospitalization and they wouldn't die, right? But then I've reduced it to 0.4% because I'm arguing, well, but actually I'm saying 0.7% of all population have already been naturally vaccinated and naturally immunized, so they don't need the vaccine, they don't benefit from the vaccination. Then I say, well, maybe elderly people are on average less likely to have been exposed to the virus because they're less active. So I said, okay, maybe they have a penetration of 0.6. So actually only 0.4% of the global population actually will benefit from the vaccine. That's 32 million people. 32 million people will actually not fall seriously ill and not run a risk of 20% of being a fatality once you're seriously ill and hospitalized, right? 32 million people will be prevented from falling seriously ill and having that risk by the vaccines. Okay? If you say we don't know who exactly they are, so by statistical means, we need to sort of cluster the population and identify those clusters where these 32 million people tend to be. I had said long ago, maybe 1 billion people. If you vaccinate 1 billion people by certain criteria, age, you will hit every single one almost, right? Every single one of those 32 million people, right? So I said, if you vaccinate 1 billion people, you've covered them all. And the likelihood that you have missed any is very small. It's not zero, right? You will have missed a few, of course, but very few. So I said, give the vaccine to 1 billion people and you're done. And remember I said in January or last December, I said, oh, by July we could be done. If you give it to the right people, 1 billion shots, we can do. And we could have done. Then we would be done now, right? But we didn't, right? We gave it largely to the wrong people. So by now we have given it to 2.27 billion people, which is 1.27 billion people more than needed, but not to the right people, or not exclusively to the right people, right? So we're still going to see fatalities. So the point here is the total effect of this whole vaccination mania will not be that big, simply because nature is quicker than we are, and the virus is quicker than we are, one, and two, where we have this weapon, if you want to call it a weapon, this vaccine, we're not giving it to the right people often. We're not smart and thoughtful about who we administer it to, right? So most of it is wasted. Right. And the last point here on that chart that hasn't changed, but we need to expect that governments will go crazy about vaccinations, right? If they see some effect, oh, we've saved some lives. Oh, why don't we do influenza vaccinations mandatory? Why don't we do discrimination on the basis of that, right? Why don't we do, oh, how about, can we have a vaccine for all the other cold viruses? Oh, 200 of them, great. I mean, the pharmaceuticals industry loves this, right? And they probably know that this is crazy, but they have no interest. They have a conflict of interest here, right? If they told the government, oh, you don't have to give this vaccine to everybody, you don't, right? If they told the governments that, they would earn less money. They're private enterprises. You can't blame them for wanting to earn money, and they don't do anything illegal, but they will not be the ones educating the governments that what they're doing is silly, right? No, because it's the pharma industry that gets the biggest monetary benefit from this, right? Not the entire industry, but some companies who invested in this. And I don't mean to denigrate them. They did a great job investing in this, right? But they're not the ones now likely to tell the government how to use the vaccine, right? In fact, talked about the Indian fellow who represented the pharma industry and who encouraged the government, oh, we cannot get out of this crisis until everybody or 80% of the population have gotten the vaccine. Yeah, very self-serving, right? Wrong and self-serving. Right? But it's unfortunate, but that's to be expected, that the private sector will now take maximum advantage of this, having been hammered by governments, so you can't really blame them, but of course it's only a few companies that really have the advantage of this, but they are not the ones to tell the governments how to actually use the vaccine. They will say, here it is, you can have it, we sell it to you, the more the merrier, but they are not going to educate the government on how to use it effectively, right? Governments will have to educate themselves, and that's not happening. Okay, long-term scenarios for humanity, you know where we are. We are moving slowly into the age of robots, where we lost trust in our immune systems. We don't trust them. We don't even talk about them. People don't seem to realize that this is actually all about the immune systems and nothing else. the virus is almost incidental. This is about how we are dealing with our immune systems in our societies. But people don't even realize that they have immune systems, right? And secondly, trust in our mental faculties. And that's the same thing. Most people don't seem to realize that their brains are made for thinking. Yeah, most people have maybe never experienced in their entire life how it is to systematically, critically, logically think. And so we are turning ourselves into robots. Robots are creatures that have no immune system and they don't think. They may have some artificial intelligence, but it's artificial and it doesn't think. It just does what it was programmed to do, including maybe learning some new tricks. You can program it to learn new tricks, but that's not thinking. So that's where we are heading, but maybe very slowly. So I won't talk about it more. Now, when I thought about how can I mean, that's a big claim to say we are becoming robots, right? That's a big claim, right? And you say, it is bullshit, right? Maybe it is bullshit. But I was trying to think about, well, what arguments could I bring? And I thought of, this Abraham Maslow guy, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maybe, it's 70 years old now, but still seems to be popular. People use it. So he was a psychologist, I think, and he said there are 5 levels of human needs. There are basic needs, the bottom, physiological needs, and then safety needs. And then there are psychological needs, love, and belongingness, and self-esteem, and so on. And on top of that, on the very tip of the pyramid, is self-fulfillment, right? And the reason he showed it as a pyramid is, I think he wanted, and I've not studied him in detail, but as far as I remember, he wanted to say that the bottom is the basis. I mean, if you don't even have enough food, you don't have any leisure to go into self-actualization, right? You're just fighting for survival, right? So he said the bottom layers are, the necessary things that provide the basis so that you can then add the other things on top. Whether that's really so, I would question that. It's a bit mechanical, but it is what it is. I mean, it's visually easy to understand, and I think it does the trick. So I'm not going to spend time arguing with this framework, right? Even though I might not fully agree with it, right? But it's okay. It's just for demonstration. It's okay. So that's what he said. And I think people who talk about modernity and that we're living in a modern age, one way of thinking about it is to say it's an age in which we finally reach a level at which we can do self-actualization. Meaning in most countries, not everywhere, but in many countries, we've got the basic things covered. Nobody starves, everybody has a roof over their head, basic clothing, everything, security is provided by the state government, by the nation state, Of course, whether they have love and belongingness, that is sort of more individual, and the government cannot do so much about it. But there's this feeling in modernity, we've covered the basis, and we've therefore opened up opportunity to move to the tip of the pyramid and for people to expand the tip of the pyramid and spend more time, more energy, more money on self-actualization, on really pursuing things they really care about, and not just spending the whole day on fixing the basics, right? Like having enough food on the table, right? Enough calorie intake and so on. So that was sort of the one way to think about modernity. Yeah, first time in human history to really expand that top of the pyramid. Now, arguably what the new normal, the people who talk about new normal in the context of COVID, what they're doing is they're turning that pyramid upside down. Right? They're putting the bottom, the base, the safety and security and basic things, they're putting that top of their agenda. Right? And the self-actualization, the freedom to do things that you really want to do is sort of an afterthought that comes at the bottom. Right? So think of it that way. That's what the new normal people who talk about the new normal, that's what they're doing. They're turning Maslow's pyramid upside down. Right? And now, if you do that for a few years, I would argue, this is not Maslow arguing, this is me now just using his little framework. If you do that for a few years, the weight of that base of the pyramid will just crunch the tip. So I wanted to show this here. This is like a crunching down, right? And at the end, when you reach the age of robots, you have reduced humans to people who do nothing but cover their basics. Because all the additional things have been crumbled under the weight you've put on things like safety and security. That everybody is like, oh, climate change, we have to save the earth. I mean, the only thing I hear on TV nowadays is violence, safety, danger, safety. As if there is nothing else to life than worrying about your safety. That's how people talk. And that's what I mean. That's what I mean by the age of robots. A robot is just a basic functioning thing. And we are reducing humanity to just a basic functioning. Survival, safety, enough food on the table, that's apparently all that people expect from life. At least those new normal kind of people. That's where we are heading if we don't pay attention. I have a long Goethe quote, oops, sorry. But in the interest of time, because I actually have to move on, I'm going to just leave this quote and also a piece of thinking that I've done on the next few slides to next time. And I'll just bring it back. It's not time sensitive, so I'll just bring it into the next presentation next month as a little teaser for you to come back and join me. One more quick quote, since I started with Zachar Masoch, the masochist. I end with the Marquis de Sade, the sadist. Both of them were intelligent beings, by the way, whatever you may think about them. The Marquis de Sade was actually a first-rate philosopher, in my view. And he says, social order at the expense of liberty is hardly a bargain. And I leave you with that. And I go to my upside-down Doraemon. Doraemon is still standing on his head. He's getting a headache. He can't use his little propeller that is up here, so he can't move. He's getting really, really quite upset and angry about it, even though he's such a kind nature. So I'm appealing to everybody that can we please start turning things back onto their feet? With that, hopefully one day Doraemon can be the right way around again, and he can fly again. And I hope to see you next time in a month's time. Take care. Bye.